Most form listeners contain a feature called Populate fields, which is a very powerful feature that allows you to pass information from browser storage into your CRM or internal marketing system through fields on forms that users submit. This could be used for something like passing a GCLID identifier from Google Ads. We're going to walk through that as an example today. The first step is to turn on the Populate Fields feature. And you'll notice that a new menu item will appear here on the left. On the screen, you'll be able to write and manage rules that push information from browser storage into hidden fields or visible fields on forms for this listener. In order to do this, however, we first need to have a piece of information stored inside of browser storage in the users session. So we'll drill into one of these rules just to show you how this works. We're going to write a condition. In this case, when a pardot form loads on a page, and when that condition is met, we're going to pass some information from some type of local storage here into a particular field on that form. And so in this case, we're going to pull a cookie called user_GCLID. Now, this is a cookie that we are populating with some browser storage rules inside of ListenLayer. But the cookie or browser storage does not need to originate from ListenLayer. You can target any browser storage that exists on your website and push that into fields on the form. So let's walk through real fast how that browser storage works. In this case, we have the URL parameters listener turned on, and we have the browser storage feature enabled. And here we have a number of rules. The one we're going to focus on is this one where we are storing the GCLID in a cookie. So go ahead and edit this. And what we'll see is that when we have a URL parameter called GCLID, this listener automatically collects that and pushes it into the data layer. And that becomes available for us to do a number of things with inside of Google Tag Manager, but also inside of ListenLayer. So in this case, we have a simple condition that says whenever this parameter exists with any value, we want to do something. And that thing that we want to do is that we want to set the value of this cookie called user GCLID. Now, this cookie name we did create up here under the global settings in browser storage variables. So what we're doing here is we're just passing the GCLID directly into this browser storage. And in this case, we want to keep the original value as long as possible. So we have this rule set to not overwrite that value, and we're going to store it for 120 days. Now you'll notice here we also have a local storage value for GCLID. We could rely on that instead of this first party cookie, and the situation would work very similar. So then navigating back to our pardot listener, we'll drill into this rule a little bit deeper. Every time a pardot form loads, we want to push the value from that cookie into a hidden field. Now, keep in mind that this condition is based on data layer activity. So the listener is listening for forms to load on the page. And when that occurs, it's going to push this event into the data layer. And when that occurs and is true, the listener is going to then get the value of this cookie and push it into a field. Now, pardot is interesting because if you have a single field on forms inside of pardot called GCLID, then when you embed that on your website, the form field is actually made unique. In other words, that input is not always the same on every single form. And so we use a selector rule here, which is a more advanced way of basically matching any field on the form that has this GCLID in one of its attributes. So we'll take a look at that in a minute, a little bit closer, once we see how the rule works on our actual website. So here we're taking a look at a test website. And in the application tab, you can see that we don't currently have any cookies with the name GCLID contained in those. And I've already pre-populated a URL here with a GCLID. So we're going to come in as if we are a user coming in off of a Google ad. And we can see now ListenLayer, because of that URL parameters listener, has seen this parameter and populated the cookie that we created and showed you inside of the interface. So now our GCLID is actually stored here and will remain there for 120 days unless cleared from some other method. And again, you can see the URL parameters listener automatically identified this parameter GCLID, and that's what triggered the storage. So now we know that that is stored, and we know that this value ends in 654321. So let's go jump to our pardot test form. And what we'll notice is that our GCLID field, which is visible just for the sake of this demonstration, was just populated with the value from that cookie. Now, of course, we would recommend this be a hidden field, but again, it's much more easy to see when we make the field visible. And what you'll see here is that this event occurred and was written to the data layer called pardot form loaded. And actually, it was pushed into the data layer and written in the console here. And because this occurred, our condition was matched and the cookie value was pushed into this field. Now let's take a look at this field so we can understand why the CSS selector is necessary. What you'll see here is that the label and the input hold these IDs, which are kind of randomly generated by pardot. And they make it difficult to identify this GCLID field globally across forms. So you might have one GCLID characteristic or field inside of pardot, and that might be added to 300 forms across your website. And if that's the case, then each of those 300 forms is going to have that GCLID field, but it's going to have a unique ID. But one thing that is not unique across all of those, but is consistent, is that the class of this p tag, which surrounds that input, has GCLID inside of it. And so oftentimes when you're pushing information into a field, that field is easy to identify and it's not made unique on each form that's on your website. I think Marketo, I think HubSpot do this much better, where if you put an email field or a GCLID field on 300 forms, the field is actually the same and it looks the same in the code as far as how it's presented. And in that case, you would be able to just select the field from this dropdown. These fields come from the listener, which identifies and sees all the information from your forms and captures it and makes it available in these variable settings, because each form field becomes a variable. So in that case, you'd be able to easily identify, hey, here's my field that might represent GCLID across all of my forms. But if you have multiple fields and you need to kind of unify them, and then push a value into those with a single, simple, powerful rule like this, we would recommend just using a CSS selector. And this basically just targets the p tag inside the HTML and only the p tag that has GCLID inside of the CSS attribute. So you may be watching this video in relation to another form system like Gravity Forms or Contact Form 7 or any of those, and you may not need to use this CSS attribute, or you might be using a form system that does require this, or be in a situation where you have multiple variations of a single field appearing on your website across different forms, and you would need to use the CSS selector attribute. Either way, this is an extremely powerful feature that allows you to pass a lot of unique information and identifiers, as well as just additional data from the user session into your marketing platforms.